I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Jess Walter has been writing novels for a really long time, and I've been reading those novels for a really long time. And you may remember The Cold Millions was a B&N Book Club pick in 20 or 21?
2020.
2020, okay. And before that, there was Beautiful Ruins, which I feel sort of changed your trajectory as a writer. We might come back to that as well. But right now we have So Far Gone. And, I have a lot of feelings about this book. You and I were sort of chatting about it before we started, but I'm so happy to see you, Jess. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Mia. It's great to see you again, too.
So Reese Kinnick, he has thrown his cell phone out the window. He has picked a fight at Thanksgiving. He has done all the things that I think plenty of folks, regardless of where they are, have thought about doing or have possibly done. But can we talk about the creation of Reese? Because I got very attached to this kind of grumpy old man.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I was channeling my own grumpy old man or late middle-aged man or something, because I was in 23 and especially 2024. I found myself just both impelled and repelled by the news and by the world around me. There was this cartoon I saw, which was a car speeding down the freeway, and ahead of it said, "Can't look away." And then there was an off-ramp that said, "Had enough." I felt like that, like I can't look away from this train wreck that feels like American history. And yet at some point I had had enough. And there's often a little bit of wish fulfillment in a character. And that idea, when he throws his cell phone out the window, it was kind of cathartic even imagining that, just because it brings us such bad news and a seeming near stream of it. And so, the creation of Reese was imagining what would happen if I did that, if I threw everything away. And to keep that sort of illusion of, what would happen to a character that I knew about, I sent him to the land that my family owns. And so the very place he goes. So it sort of started that way. He, as often happens with fiction, you then get to know the character more. They open up in this way. And our differences are more interesting to me than the fact that we're both a little fed up with the news and the culture and the direction of the country.
Reese also strikes me as a guy who is a little impulsive.
Yeah.
And doesn't, his daughter at Thanksgiving has a very simple request for him. Please do not fight with my husband.
Right. Yeah.
And she says it slightly differently. She says, please don't talk about politics or religion or anything else. But really, it comes down to, Dad, please don't fight with my husband.
Yeah. And I can't imagine there isn't a family that hasn't, or friendships that haven't been tested in this time. And I wanted to take a heightened version of that. But really, that's one of the things I learn about Reese that I think the reader learns about Reese is how much more complex this is. It isn't just the outside world that's getting to him. It's his own character. It's the decisions he's made. It's the failure of the career that he had. And more than the failure of the career he had, the sort of dissolution of the world the way he saw it. You think, you're a journalist, you're an environmentalist like him, you have a science degree, you believe in a sort of empiricism. And to watch the way that's crumbled around the edges with, the sort of destruction of so many institutions, I think back to, I sort of first started covering some of the conspiracy theories that people some of this book in 1992 when I covered the Ridge standoff. And so many of the things that I saw then led people to sort of demonize the government, the government stealing from you, it's out to get you. And to watch that spread like a virus to media, to libraries, to science, to medicine after the pandemic and schools, voting itself, all the institutions that we used to have trust in, that trust is at an all-time low. And so I wanted Reese to have the job I had, which was a journalist, one of those kind of pillars of trust that I think, because we don't know where to put our trust now. I think we are even far more fractured and in a kind of crisis of reality, because we're all looking at different versions of events coming to us over social media or wherever it is we're getting our information.
But media literacy, right? Like, that's a thing that used to matter. You used to be able to say, oh, well, Walter Cronkite or, Tom Brokaw or, I grew up reading the Boston Globe, right?
Sure,
and the New York Times and all of that kind of thing. And I remember coverage of Ruby Ridge. I mean, I was a young adult, but I mean, it was in the news, but the way it was covered was kind of like, mistakes are happening, we don't know what's going on. But the way we even talk about almost everything now has become hyperbolic at best.
Yeah.
And everything's on 11, right? It's that bad Spinal Tap line. It's like, let's just turn the volume up to 11, and everything's on 11 right now.
Yeah.
It's just...
We're living in a Nigel Tufnell world.
Yeah, and I like visiting that movie, but I would like it to not be every Tuesday.
And I think part of that is the technology, is the phone. For a long time, as a former journalist, I imagined that, well, Fox and we've got MSNBC, and there's some sort of equivalency. Some people watch this, some people watch that. But it's not even that anymore. More than half of people get some or all of their news from social media. And so all they're getting is a sort of reflection of someone's anger over the issues. And, I'll have family and friends say to me, "Did you know this?" And I'll say, "Well, that's not true, actually." And that's on the left and the right.
Right.
So
No, absolutely.
some bit of information that you think you heard that comes in. So the sort of external forces that are making Reese Kinnick want to move off the grid and live in a cabin in the woods, I think are really universal. I think a lot of us understand them. The internal ones were the ones that you have to create as a character.
But he's also still not prepared for the raccoons. No one's ever prepared for the raccoons.
He's not prepared for much. When I was researching this, I decided he would live off the grid, and the house that I lived in as a kid, an old cinder block house in the middle of the woods that we had to heat with a wood stove and had to get creek water and boil it to drink because our well was spoiled when we first moved in. And so I sent him to that very place, but I imagined, how would I do living off the grid, trying to figure out how to make a compost toilet and how to use solar panels? And I'm not handy at all. And so I decided, I went to a friend who lives totally off the grid. They don't produce any garbage. They eat every bit of food that they bring in. It's like an experiment in having the least amount of impact on the world around you. And when I was done, I said, "Now this is fascinating. Now you know me. How would it look if I tried to do it?" And that was kind of how I built the character of Reese. 7 years later, he still hasn't figured out his compost toilet, and he has marine batteries sitting all around to power everything. And so I wanted a more haphazard kind of, the kind of character that I like to write, who maybe is, not an expert at these things.
And he does also kind of live in his own orbit. I mean, he's working on what he's calling a book, as he describes to his granddaughter. Yeah. And even the adolescent child looks at him and says, but 2,000 pages?
Right.
And I can imagine this kid. I'm quite fond of Leah. She's also, I have to give you tons of credit for, she's not one of these 12-year-olds who sounds like she's 50.
Right.
And she does a couple of things where I'm like, oh, no, oh, you did it. Okay. Yeah. Which I love about your characters, because they frequently do this. But I'm going to use that moment to jump back to Bethany, who is Reese's daughter and Leah's mom. And you and I obviously are going to have a spoiler-free conversation about this, but
we'll do our best. Yeah.
Bethany made some choices. Yeah. She made some choices about her marriage, and she made some choices about her own life, and I wanted Bethany to make a couple of different choices. I will be perfectly honest with you that I got very mad at. But I'm talking to you about a fictional character as if she's real. Yeah,
which is all that an author wants to hear.
Right.
Is that we're gossiping about someone we both know. Exactly. Yeah, in the beginning of the book, when Reese's grandchildren show up, Asher and Leah, and he has to, kind of emerge into the world. I knew how I wanted to launch that story, but there's always a moment when you are excavating those characters and trying to figure out, how did Bethany end up in the situation she's in? And Reese has sort of made a joke of her bad taste in men and her bad decision making. And there's, again, not to give anything away, but there's a moment later in the book when he says something like, "Wow, it must be hard being married to that guy." And she says, "What's so hard is your constant disappointment in me." That struck me as so true, that she knows she's made mistakes. She knows she's gone down this road. The real crime is to not be able to do it with your parents, to have them helping you along the way. And I don't think she's the first person, either real or fictional, who keeps repeating mistakes and can't seem to get back on the path they're on. But that was one of the journeys I wanted the novel to take.
But it also makes it more interesting. I mean, honestly, if Bethany and Reese are getting along, there's no story.
No story,
Nothing happens. And listen, I love a novel where nothing happens. This is not that book.
No. A lot happens. That's true.
And we need the stakes to be high, because also part of what you're talking about too, I mean, masculinity, right? Like, we have a crisis of loneliness. I'm not the first person to say this. And it seems to me that men are questioning lots of things that they've always thought. I mean, you've got Reese questioning his life. You've got Shane, who's Bethany's husband, questioning his life. You've got other characters who are questioning their lives as well. And I don't want to, again, trying to be spoiler free here. But, you know, this idea that we had a monoculture for a really long time, and there are still people who really think that we should aim for monoculture, that has never really been the case. And I'm watching your characters struggle with all of these things they've been taught.
And I think even if you agree with something culturally, politically, it still has an effect on you. And so a character like Reese can sort of agree that the success of unbridled masculinity in the culture is not exactly it's a that doesn't seem to be the path. But then as sort of a person, as a human being, as a father, as a grandfather, how do you comport yourself? And he has a couple of sidekicks, men his age in their 50s or 60s, who are trying to sort of grapple with the same thing, and also the end of their careers. You know, he ends up with a retired police officer named Chuck, who apparently is off his meds, perhaps. And Chuck, I think, is battling that same thing. What good am I when I'm not my job anymore?
Right.
And I think that is larger than maybe the cultural issue of how to grow up to be a man, or, you know, what Shane's going through. I think that's a really universal thing when you've defined yourself by your career. And now, in Reese's case, his career, environmental journalist, has been eroded out of the culture almost. For Chuck, it's just his age and, you know, maybe his mental health that have caused him to be away from his job. But having those characters, you know, trying to solve the struggle at the heart of this novel, while also trying to figure out who they're supposed to be and how they're supposed to be. For me, it opened up some great pathos with, you know, some avenues for comedy.
Let's talk about fiction, though, as a bigger piece, because one of the things I really love when I'm reading one of your novels, and you have written across sort of a variety of ideas and characters, and I mean, you've won an Edgar Award and you were a finalist for the National Book Award, and, you know, Cold Millions is historical fiction, but there's always just this core of empathy for messy human beings, which make for great reading. And I sort of feel like I always walk away. I mean, I remember reading Beautiful Ruins for the first time and thinking, wait a minute, this is the same, wait, what? How did we, what? And I'm not really one for sort of a big romantic plot. I'm kind of like, well, you know, Bostonian, we don't really know what to do with that. But I love that book, and I still buy lots of copies for people of Beautiful Ruins. And but you can see the direct line between Beautiful Ruins and The Cold Millions and So Far Gone, even though subject-wise, you might think that they're not necessarily.
Yeah, I suppose I probably take an unhealthy amount of pride in the fact that I jump around genres, that people sometimes think a woman named Jess Walter wrote Beautiful Ruins, that other people think, you know, that I'm a hard-boiled writer or something. I guess I consider myself a great character actor of fiction, and I get deep inside a fictional world. That world sort of tells me the story it wants to. And I read all genres. I read all over. So the idea that I would somehow limit myself, you know, to, you know, one bartender who solves crimes, or, you know, to only writing existential romances laid out 50 years, you know, me, that I can't really imagine. Can't imagine that I would read only the same kind of book. So I can't imagine I would write only the same kind. But I do once I get carried away by an idea, I do think I invest many of the same qualities in everything. There's often a wistful sense of humor. There's often these kind of searchers. And maybe what I meant by looking for answers from books or authors, that I'm often on that same journey, trying to find the answer. What would make someone come back almost 50 years later and try to find someone that they met who they didn't even have a romance with? And that question fuels Beautiful Ruins. With this one, it's interesting. One of the things that as I was writing, I kept thinking that the whole book could work as statements and questions. So each chapter begins, what happened to Kinnick? And it tells you what happened to Kinnick, but it's also a question, what happened to Kinnick? What happened to Shane? It tells you what happened to Shane, but it's also, what happened to Shane? How did we get here? And that question hovers over the novel. How did we get here? And the novel is my attempt to tell not a universal story, but with these characters. And even the title, So Far Gone, to me is a question. Are we so far gone that we can't reconcile these realities that seem so broken? Or is it possible for a redemption? And that's the question I pose to myself as I start writing.
But it also brings me back to sort of this big beating heart of every one of your novels. And again, like, even the crime novels have a big beating heart. Like, I mean, so. You do this Jess Walter thing. But I don't ever want to lose sight of that, because also partially for me, you're dropping me into places that I wouldn't. I mean, I can find Spokane on a map. I have not been there.
You and everyone else.
Well, but I get dropped into these worlds, right? Or, you drop me back in time, or I end up in the woods next to a cinder block house. I don't camp. I'm a city person. I'm a real city person. But I trust you implicitly to give me a cast that I want to relate to. Even if I have nothing in common with them, it's just, I really do. I want to see, or in some cases, fight with them. Bethany.
Yes. I'll let her know.
Listen, I don't have a problem with Bethany going to the music festival. That is not my issue. I understand going to the music.
That's almost the best decision she makes.
Yes. And that I'm just like, go do the thing you need to do. There are other things, though, where I get frustrated with the value that she seemingly has put on herself. Yeah. And I mean, obviously she loves her kids. Please don't misunderstand me. Like, she does love her husband, but I'm looking at him going, is he worth it? She is complicated and alive and her very own person. Yeah. And here I am fighting with a fictional character, which that's my idea of fun, honestly. Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, because she, as we said, I think she's one of those characters who we see at three different points: when she's young, several years later, and then in sort of the action of the novel. And so in those 10 years that after she meets Shane, again, I don't think she's the only person to wake up one day and say, how did this get so far away from what I wanted? And the frog boiling slowly in the water. And we're reading, what I wanted to write was a novel at a point in which characters, again, have gone so far that there's nowhere left for them to go, that the rubber band is about to snap. And I think that's the case with Bethany too. The decisions have not added up to the life she wanted. Her mother has passed away. I don't think that gives away too much.
No.
And now, in the beginning of the novel, she is really adrift, and she reaches out, in her way, to the one person who is almost more adrift than her, and that's her dad. And I think it's a kind of desperation that causes her to think he'll help with the kids in this moment of crisis for her. Again, it's but all of that fallibility to me is always where humor comes in. I make a lot of the same mistakes that I made when I was 13, 15, 19, 22. I'd love to not make them. They follow me around like groupies or something. My clumsiness, my inability to do exactly what I set out to do. And so those characters, to me, I think, as infuriating as they can be, they're also pretty real.
But also humor. I mean, I need humor as a valve.
Yeah.
I think we all do. I was taping a live episode of the show last night, and a big part of what was running through that book was grief. And I'm the person who's going to laugh at the funeral. Yeah. And I don't think it's the Bostonian part. I think some of us are just built to need a release valve and please give me the darkest pit of black comedy you can find, because otherwise it all feels a little icky. And
maybe especially now. I mean,
yeah, right?
yeah. I'm the same way, and I think of it. I get asked this quite a bit in interviews. How do you write funny? How do you? And I almost never think that I am. When I have to come up with a joke, I don't know any jokes. What to me is comic is in a more philosophical sense. The puncturing of vanities, the hubris leading you into problems. There are moments, there are moments that I know a character has a funny line of dialogue.
Right.
A member of a militia worried that if his truck tire gets shot out and he has to buy a new one, that they won't wear evenly, and I know at that moment that that's a ridiculous thing to say, but we live in kind of ridiculous times, and we have to balance, our fear and our horror with laughter. It's one of the great things about being human, and it's where the fiction almost always takes me, is that place where humor intersects with something else.
But that's also the beauty of a novel, right? And I'm pulling out novels as opposed to short stories because obviously, the structural differences are pretty significant when it comes to interiority, right? Like a short story, hinge moment, before, after, that's kind of all we need to know. And then if we get great language, cool.
Yeah,
but with a novel, we get this all of these moments of interiority that we don't have the luxury necessarily of seeing, even on film, even on maybe over 17 series of a thing, sure. But I mean, I like to luxuriate in someone else's head, right? It's the ultimate act of eavesdropping.
Yes, yeah.
When you get to poke around. And we still haven't figured out how to talk about grief. We still haven't figured out a way. And I'm not just talking about grief in the present moment, but when you were talking about aging and the end of Chuck's career and what do I mean when I don't have my job anymore? Or, Reese with his whole, my career doesn't exist, my role doesn't exist, my career doesn't exist. Aging and grief, we don't talk about that. All of these things that I'm kind of feeling well, now we have this novel and everyone can maybe sort of start to talk about it, because sometimes memoirs hit too close and it's well, but you have these comic old men, nobody's fool. That Richard Russo novel that we all love.
Right.
And the whole series, right? It's not just New Englanders who find that book funny, right?
Right. No, and that's the universal quality, I think. It's and I think there are entire arms of philosophy and psychology that believe everything that we do is in denial of death, of truth, of where we're headed. And that's what's really happening to, someone who's forced into retirement, is what next? What now? Mm-hmm. And I think it's, so I think that's definitely what some of the characters are feeling.
Speaking of character, though, Spokane. We need to talk about
pronunciation, by the way.
Spokane. Thank you for that. Spokane is one of these not huge cities, but also not rural.
Right.
And it sits at the intersection of Idaho and Washington, but woods and city, and you've got clearly a class structure where there are people who are very comfortable and people who are clearly without. You've lived in Spokane your entire life.
Yeah.
And you always thought you were going to leave, and yet that didn't happen. And I feel like even when you're writing in New York, setting things in New York or Italy or wherever you're going, Spokane is there. And I'm one of these people who believes that place can be character as well. So when you grow up in New England,
how can you not?
That place, I probably still carry that place around with me, whether I know it or not. But I do think that Spokane is a piece of you.
Yeah, no, how could it not be? And I think we're all from someplace and it affects us in different ways. And there are writers, of course, who take the Joycean route and only write about their home once they leave it. I had a sort of Capra-like It's a Wonderful Life love story with my hometown where, as a teenage father, and then as someone nursing a mother dying of cancer and a father with Alzheimer's and two more kids and in-laws with their health issues and, 3 kids. And I did many times I thought, I would leave Spokane. And then you wake up one day and you realize this place is as big a part of you as your personality. the air is only here does the air feel right. Does the river going by my house feel right? And I also reached a place where I could be gone 3, 4, 6 months a year and then come back to the place I'm from, which I think is also important. And it became my sort of favorite thing to leave and come back. I think it is a really unique place. There aren't too many cities this size, 200 some thousand with a metro of 600,000 that aren't near anywhere else. Well, my good friend Anthony Dorr lives in Boise, which is almost the mirror image, same size city with nothing around it. And so it creates almost a lab if you think about it. It has all the wealth, it has all the poverty, it has, but it exists in its own sort of world, which for a fiction writer is a great thing. And I think now I've set more than half my fiction here, which means I immediately need to go to, the south of France or maybe Dublin and quickly write some short stories and a novel, get the balance right again. But this book really felt like it had to be written here. The Northwest is a place where the forces that are at work here, this sort of strain of radical right-wing militia type thought, and sort of grounded, much more liberal or progressive people comes in conflict all the time. There is a and sometimes doesn't come in conflict, which is the most lovely thing. There's a swap meet up in the Canadian woods where I always thought far left and far right meet in at this place where everybody is sort of assuming that they're going to have to live off the land at some point, and for me, it was a great setting for this book, and also to write about a small or medium-sized journalist, which is again what I was, where my path began.
One of the trippiest things too, when I'm looking back on your, like, if I think about the paperback edition of Beautiful Ruins, there are like 17 pages of excerpted reviews.
Yeah.
Because I mean, your career has followed sort of the ramping up of book reviews and then the falling off of the cliff. I mean, it used to be you could plan tours and there would be morning shows and there would be local radio. I was a publicist back in the day too.
Sure. Yeah.
But I mean, you could do all sorts of things and then a bookstore event. And now the world has shrunk in really strange ways.
I saved my first book tour because it was for the Ruby Ridge book, which was a huge national story. And so I just like to look at those, at each of the events listed. It's like Good Morning America, Charlie Rose, Nightline, and then on your way back from New York, you're hitting every bookstore. And it only felt like there were 11 authors on the road, and now it does feel like there's so many books out there. I can't imagine a more unlikely career than I've had. And it makes me so pleased to get to write in so many different styles and genres and have readers come along. But I do miss the days when I was, waiting with bated breath for the Milwaukee Sentinel's book reviewer to chime in, so.
We used to have to clip things physically and glue them onto Xerox pages, and then we would Xerox that and circulate. I mean, there were things, I think I've told the story before, but I once bought a plane ticket to get a box of books to a bookstore in North Carolina.
Oh, that's amazing.
And there were a lot of Post-it notes and a lot of paper calendars, and it was like, what city got what color and all of these. Because, at one point, plain paper faxes were, that was high tech, right? You didn't have to deal with thermal paper because thermal paper would disappear. I mean, all of these things, right? That, well, were not glamorous, but meant we could get to the business of selling books and connecting readers and writers in a different way. But I still love this idea that I can take your characters, though, right? And with no experience of them in a day-to-day. So, I mean, I live in New York. I spend a lot of time in Los Angeles. I mean, the woods are. I went to college in Maine, so I spent time in the woods. But I'm good. I like sidewalks.
Better, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know my limits. But the idea that I can be immersed in other people's humanity is actually still really thrilling to me.
Yeah.
And I don't have to get on a plane. I can literally pick up a book and start reading and think, oh, okay, well, Jess had an idea, and I'm going to see where this goes.
I think that's so similar to the feeling of writing, and I've thought that forever, that when you're writing a book, you're almost creating a piece of music that someone else is going to pick up and play on their piano, and they're going to interpret it in their way. It might sound different, but when we watch a movie, we all tend to watch the same movie. But I think every reader brings something different to the book. That's one of my favorite parts. It also means not every reader likes everything you do, and that in the end is also part of the sort of lovely part of it, that if at least they're engaged with the characters in that way you're talking, and they're going on the journey. And this book really is a journey. It's a road trip novel. He crosses the Idaho border. And the other thing about Spokane is we're by these borders. And so I really wanted, in that sort of Charles Portis way, to send these characters on a journey of partial self-discovery and partial just immersion in a world that seems a little bit insane or outlandish.
And the thing about True Grit is it holds up.
No, it holds up. Yeah.
It totally holds up. And listen, there are some, I tried a reread of a couple of things that were very important to me in my late teens, and no. But True Grit.
Can you share which books don't?
It was Tropic of Cancer. It was Henry Miller. And I loved that book when I was 18, and 18-year-old me, all props. She read a lot, but oof.
Well, it's funny.
That does not hold up as an adult.
Right. I wish this novel had True Grit's sense of voice and character, but to me it's a little closer to a book of his called Dog of the South or Norwood.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which are also road trip novels. And Dog of the South has one of my favorite beginnings because his best friend has run off with his car and his wife, and the protagonist in that novel decides he's going to go get his car back. And I've always thought that's a great sort of, it's not the Holy Grail. It's just to get your car back, and that idea of a quest novel really sort of, a picaresque that, in which we're venturing out really sort of stuck with me once this idea landed.
But it's a great frame. There are a couple of different points in the novel where things get a little intense.
Yeah.
And again, you need humor, though, as a valve, because otherwise it becomes a very different book.
Yeah.
And again, I keep coming back to the idea that it's not the worst thing to laugh at how absurd. Like, what else are you going to do? I mean, look at Candide, right? Like, or, Don Quixote, all of these sort of deep classics, right? Tristram Shandy.
Right, yeah.
Look at the work that Percival Everett's been doing for 35 years. I mean, you kind of have to laugh, because if you don't, your head might explode.
Yeah, you have to laugh. And I think that self-seriousness that is kind of the enemy of really understanding the world, and leads to, a kind of hopelessness and self-pity. And I think in many ways it's the most hopeful thing you can do, is to continue to laugh at the world, no matter how scary it gets or how, because it's peopled by human beings like you or not like you, but who are also driven by their frailties and their fears. And once you realize that, I don't know, I think the top comes off the world and you can see the works a little more clearly.
Well, and the only way through is through. And if anyone had told Reese Kinnick that this was going to be his life, he would not have believed them.
Right.
Bethany, not the best student. She was figuring some stuff out. She liked her life, but no one was going to say to Bethany, well, we expect you to get a PhD and then go work for NASA. She's a lovely girl, but no one had those kinds of designs on her. And I think Reese, though, probably had some designs for himself.
Yeah,
I think he bought into the idea that he could change the world.
And I tend to think of Bethany as a little bit of a victim of an untimely divorce. Okay. And I've had friends who say, well, we're waiting until the kids are this age or that age.
Oh.
And I'm not saying that people shouldn't get divorced. I have one, they can be great. But to think that there's an age in which, I know people in their 30s whose parents got divorced, and it devastates them and shakes their world. And I think in my mind, that's what happens to Bethany. Is the minute her world is shaken up and reformed, she just doesn't have footing. And I think that's the case with all the characters. Different things shake their world up and they lose their footing. For Shane, her husband, it might be an addiction that he had that shook his world up. And when he resettled it, it just didn't make sense anymore. And I think, for Kinnick, it really is losing his job. At the same time, he's estranged from his family. At the same time, his relationship with Lucy, this woman that he's taken up with, is sort of falls apart. And I think for all of them, and again, I just think it's the most common thing is to have the world shaken apart like that and then not recognize the place you are and your place in it. And how we react to that is really, where the characters find themselves when the book starts.
You don't place moral judgment on these characters either.
I hope I do. Yeah.
I certainly had some moments where I was placing moral judgment, but I'm the reader. That always feels like a high wire act to me, right? Like when I see a writer doing lots of different things and I'm like, oh, I see where that could have turned, right? I mean, let's face it, I read a lot. But when you see, and then you're pleasantly surprised, and there's a lot of, okay, I see what you did there. That was quite great because, Brian, for instance, has a couple of moments where I'm like, wasn't expecting that, but okay. But I think not passing moral judgment matters, right?
I guess I wouldn't know how else to be as a human,
Okay.
Not that I don't disagree with some people and think their world is all wrong, but I don't think there are very many characters that wake up in the morning and twirl their mustache and think how they can go out and express their villainy to their utmost. I think most people justify the world in their mind, and especially because this is a novel about whether or not a family is too far apart, is too far gone to reconcile. The only path back is one through understanding, I think. And again, if I weren't writing about a family, there are a couple characters outside the family whose point of view we don't get, and they are allowed to sort of live in their mustache twirling villainy. But I guarantee if I wrote that character, you would at least understand why he thinks the thing he's doing is right,
I felt like I was pretty clear, actually.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah.
Reese wrote a story. Someone read the story. The story was about him, and the person in question had big feelings about that story.
It, ruined his life in some ways. Yeah.
I felt like I had the backstory I needed on Dean. I didn't feel like there was any mustache twirling. I did feel like, oh, this is a guy who's just a true believer.
Right.
And you're not going to bump him off of his wave. There is no having a conversation at Thanksgiving with Dean and getting him to see another point. He's just not that guy. He is absolutely sure of his place in the world and what he believes and how he's going to maintain it and all. We've all met people like that.
It's funny that you mentioned that, me saying that novels or maybe authors are not the place to look for answers, because they are almost the only characters I don't trust are people who are certain they have the answer. And,
well, yes.
I like seekers and people who live in the question, as Rainer Maria Rilke said, and I like, so I tend to write characters who live in the question. Dean is a character who is sure that the answer is guns and masculinity and returning to a place where, a woman did what a man said, and he had dominion over all the animals and everything. And so for me, those are the only characters that are hard for me to have insight into, because, or maybe not to have insight into, but, they aren't characters. When you talked about what you'd find in a Jess Walter book, I hope you find seekers and people really open to the world and open to other human beings, and to solving problems with them.
But a seeker does have to bump into a thing every now and again.
Yeah, Reese bumps into quite a few things in this novel.
I mean, there's some bumpiness, but I mean, where would a seeker be if there weren't things to bump into? If it were smooth sailing again, then we really wouldn't get the thing. We wouldn't get the.
We live in a world where people are clinging to unlikely sureties and unlikely answers, and so I think that's the world that he has to navigate in a way. And the answers people are seeking in this book are, everything from, Christian nationalism to ketamine, and so the journey that he goes on is sort of navigating those things and trying to find his way back to the place, I think, where he lost Bethany, especially.
It is really a hopeful book. I mean, I don't think you write books that are not hopeful on the whole, but this one feels especially kind of, and it's certainly, I mean, The ending is very organic, very satisfying.
Good.
I mean, I will say I think lots of folks are going to be okay.
I hope so.
I think there are folks that I am betting on being okay, but I think they have a better shot now than they did when we first meet them.
That could very well be. When we talk about characters, there's a moment in which I feel like Reese and Shane both are people who have blamed the outside world for their problems. And the thing that brings them back together, or that I hope can bring people back together, is family, is protecting what we care about. So I really appreciated what Ann Patchett said about the novel, that I take some really hard ingredients and make something nice out of it, and make something lovely out of it. And my son is fond of criticizing what he calls my toxic positivity. And so if that's where the novels go in the end, I think it says a lot about the way I see the world, and the idea that if we're going to be here, we are going to work toward something positive, toward some hope. Not everything goes in that direction. And, as Kafka said, there is always hope, but not for us. And so, it may be that what we're aiming for, we don't achieve, but I still like to think it's out there.
I just also think it's important for us to work with sort of what's in front of us, right? Like, I'm all for a great giant escapist fantasy. There's fun stuff to read. But I do think there's something to be said, right? Like, a great sci-fi novel can be a parable for stuff that's happening around the corner. And just, excuse me for being queen of the obvious for a second. But the idea that, and I think Patchett is totally spot on with this when she says, yeah, you took some rough stuff and turned it into it. Because you let your people be people, your character. If we lose sight of our shared humanity, right? That's the thing. That's the thing that's going to do us in. And one of the things I love about reading novels is you get to luxuriate in the time spent with these people. And also, frankly, you can put something down and pick it up again.
Right.
I mean, do I like reading a novel in a single setting?
Like
yes. I do, but you have options. Right?
Yeah. Well, and that amount of time you live with those characters changes you too. I think we're reading a lot about how technology has changed the wiring of brains, and fiction reading especially has always shown to change it. It generates empathy. We know that, but I think it does more than that too. I think it just broadens our view of the world and our ability to understand and to make better decisions. And how many of us put ourselves in some fictional place, and imagine. And as far as, I also like escapist fiction. I have always thought as a journalist, and the way I came up, that one of my responsibilities is to reflect the world as it is around me. I just finished reading Christopher Isherwood's Berlin Stories, which I'd never read.
Oh, seriously? Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh, wonderful. And and just the wildness of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s leading into the 30s. But then the threat of Nazism just coming in around the edges until at the very end, you feel the full weight of it on his Jewish friends, on these gay characters who, and that book is so relevant because it captures the moment that, a moment that repeats itself historically, and so I've always thought that's one of the things a novelist should try to do, is to look back or even look out the window as it's happening and try to describe what we're experiencing and how it feels.
Have you started the next thing?
Yeah, I'm always working on 2 or 3 things at once.
Okay.
I've been writing forever, not forever, but for years, a kind of big love triangle between 3 really ambitious people, where the real thread is not the other person, but all of their ambitions. And
I would really like to read that. Can we possibly have that? I realize I'm not placing a fast food order, but at the same time, I would really like to read that.
I will try to type faster. Yeah.
Ambition is so fascinating, right? You've got half the world pretending they have no ambition, and half the world saying, "Of course I have ambition. Get out of my way." Right. And it's wild to me, and especially the way we talk about men and ambition and women and ambition.
This all came about, I was doing a Q&A, and they said, if you weren't a writer, what would you do? And I love basketball. I wanted to be a professional basketball player. I had no chance of that. But I got to thinking, I knew that the odds of me making money playing basketball, probably 1 in a million. And I also think the odds of me being a successful novelist coming from from a working class
Right.
family, as a teen dad, that those were also really long odds. And I thought, what other things would people say, if you wanted to go into pharmacy? And I said, well, there's about
Right.
a 1 in 6,000 chance you'll support yourself. You'd say, well, I think I'll
Right.
change my major. Writers would jump at that chance. 1 in 6,000, I'll take that.
Right.
Basketball players would, and so thinking of people who are in the arts or in something that is so that is also connects with your daydreams, and then putting those three people, putting a basketball player, a writer, and a screenwriter in a triangle, just seemed to me like the perfect way to kind of measure how our ambition and our sense of love for ourselves and for the other person and for what we do can clash sometimes.
That's a wild landscape. That is,
Yeah, it'll be
because
fun.
also when you think of the people too that end up in each of those orbits,
Right. Yeah. They're very
and
specific. Yeah. Yeah.
but then the sort of collision. Yeah. Okay.
Anyway,
I'm gonna sit here quietly while you do that because it sounds
yeah.
great. It
It's been
sounds
fun.
great.
It's been fun to write. So I'm working on that, and often I will. This happened with Beautiful Ruins, which
Mm.
took almost 15 years to finish. I would write for a while, and I would have to back off those characters and let them just sort of live. And this is another sort of larger canvas over a larger period of time. And sometimes when I back out, then this other story comes to me, and that's what happened with So Far Gone. And I wanted to tell something with just a kind of relentless pace and this tense premise. And I wanted it to be propulsive in a way that just finished itself in a way. So
And it did. I mean, I can see how this book got written in a couple of years.
yeah.
I can see how these are characters that you wanted to spend real time with. I'm certainly glad I got to hang out with them. Even the ones where I was either judging them or thinking, yeah, I'm really glad we're not meeting in real life. But again, that's the pleasure of a great novel, right? Like we just get to sit and luxuriate and decide how we can engage
Yeah. And look over
with
their
an
shoulder.
idea, right?
Yeah,
Like
right.
essentially novels are just
Yeah.
lots of beautiful words about stuff. It's
About
quite exciting.
stuff.
But wait, I have to ask you because there was an interview too where you're like, I'm reading Middlemarch, and I finally read Middlemarch.
Yeah.
And I read it for an event because apparently I had to put a deadline on myself. Did you finally finish Middlemarch? Because this was from a couple of years ago.
I did, and it was funny. The actress Julia Sweeney,
Mm-hmm.
who's from Spokane, as a matter of fact,
Oh, I
from
didn't know that.
my life, she gave it to me, and because I had never read
Mm.
it, and oh man, it's an entire world,
Yeah, right?
yeah, yeah. I found myself wanting to sort of get back to what's her name, the original
Dorothea?
Dorothea. Thank you.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
found every time I got away from Dorothea, I was like,
yeah.
no, what's happening with Dorothea? And her trip to Rome was the most like devastating thing. It was, so, but no, I loved it. And it was nice to scratch that one off my list. I think I have 3 copies back there because I would buy it every once in a while and venture into it. And as someone whose formal education ended
Mm-hmm.
a little early, so I could go to work and support the family, and feel like I'm always catching up on things, and it was nice to cross that one off the list.
I'm right there with you. I liked it so much more because I'd been sort of making fun of my not having read it for years, and I had friends who'd say, "No, no, really, you of all people would like this novel," and I kept going, "All right, fine." And I did it for an event, and it was totally worth it. And I was like, "Oh." I caught myself texting a friend, one of the friends who'd been riding me to read it, and I was texting her at like 11 o'clock, going, "I can't believe he put that clause in his will."
Yes.
You know what
Yeah,
I'm talking about? And
yeah,
I was very invested in Dorothea, less so
yeah,
in her sister.
Causabon, yeah,
And I
Causabon.
was so mad. I was like, that creep. And she's
Yeah.
laughing. Like, I just get all of these emojis back. She's laughing at me. She's like, yeah,
And,
see, I
and
told you so.
and something about that language which puts off a 21st century reader at first,
Yeah.
because it's richness and it's long
Mhm.
sentences and it's complete mastery of the world. But then that mastery of the world strikes you in these ways you can't believe, and you think we've lost something. Our advances in technology are incredible, but I think we sometimes know less about human nature each generation. It almost feels as if something that a novel like that contains the entire code of how humans fail each other and strive and all that. And I suppose that project is still ongoing with novels now. I know it's what I set out to do, but boy, I marveled at the intelligence behind that book.
Yeah, but this is why we keep reading fiction.
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is why we watch the evolution of ourselves, we watch the evolution of the world, and sometimes we think, wow, not so much has changed. That's a little horrifying. So, I mean, I don't know. I think fiction's a pretty cool invention. I'm fond of the novel as an art form.
No,
I would like more, please.
I wish everyone would read with your enthusiasm and grace, because it's
we're working on it.
Yeah, you are.
But Jess, thank you so much for making the time. This was great.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
Let's do it again with the next book.
I'll get to work. Yeah.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.